Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from London, UK, Jules Chappell, OBE. Jules, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Jules is the Chief Executive Officer of Kokoro. She formerly was the Chief Executive Officer of London and Partners Events. She's on the board of Climate Cares at Imperial College London, Face Space and L'Oreal's Climate Emergency Fund. And a few years ago, Jules was recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. So Jules, before we talk about Kokoro, tell me about your own amazing journey.
Thank you. I think I've had what is commonly known perhaps as a bit of a squiggly career. But I started off as a British diplomat, and I was posted in Jordan, Iraq, Ethiopia, working with the African Union, Washington, DC, seconded into the US State Department. And then I was ambassador in Guatemala, covering Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So that was kind of the start of my career, focusing a lot on conflict and peace negotiations and peace building. And I mean, it was the most amazing experience, but I'd always wanted to do something in the private sector. It felt like something to, have a really kind of balanced career. So I went and joined a startup, which is a pretty brutal way to learn about all things private sector.
Absolutely.
And helped to build a communications company where my particular focus was helping to support impact entrepreneurs and impact investors. I did that for a few years. Again, incredible experience. And then I went and worked with London, setting up or building rather relations between London and lots of cities all around the world, focusing on trade and investment, but also particularly big events, which I thought was super exciting. Hence, then went and worked as CEO of the events company for London. And then the last few years, I've been focusing on mental health, and that's Kokoro. So yes, I mean, talk about trying to learn a lot from different sectors and different, particularly people working globally all over the world.
Oh, amazing. So let's talk about Kokoro now. Tell me about what are the main focus areas of Kokoro?
Well, so at Kokoro, we champion mental health as the foundation for a safer, kinder, and more productive world. And really what we're doing is we're looking at positive mental health and supporting mental health, not only as a health outcome, as a good of itself, but also looking at how it cuts across every area of life that involves human beings. So it certainly cuts across all the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we focus particularly on the community of private sector funders. That could be individuals and families or companies. And we do three things. So connecting, championing, and scaling. So connecting is recognizing that there isn't really enough funding in mental health. And so we connect those that are funding, both investing and philanthropy and kind of everything in between, to make sure that the funding that is going into mental health is as effective and impactful as it can be. Scaling is about helping to integrate more mental health funding into other areas of work, both for the sake of mental health and to accelerate other outcomes. And then championing is really trying to make sure that those on the frontline services, or those people with lived experience of mental health, we're using our network to get their stories and their experience and expertise out.
Fascinating. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced in running a not-for-profit organization focused on mental health?
I mean, simply the biggest challenge is that the global need is so massive, and the access to support and services is really very small. There was a pretty stark statement in the WHO did a mental health report last year. And I think, I don't want to misquote them, but essentially the opening paraphrasing was, mental health is neglected by most communities and most health and social systems. So it's pretty damning. But I think where we get excited is if you think about the physical health revolution that the world has gone through over the past 70 years, in 1950, I'm going to read the stat to get it right. In 1950, the global average life expectancy across the world was 45 and a half years old.
Right.
Last year, in fact, no, sorry, this year, the stats have just come out. It's 73 years old.
Wow.
I mean, that's extraordinary transition. That is a far greater access to understanding and basic services for physical health all around the world. And I get very excited. Yes, the biggest challenge is just the gap in between need and access.
Correct.
But goodness, if we can have this level of mental health revolution, because at the top end of things, what we can now do with new technologies and the kind of neuroscience that is going on and our understanding, it's extraordinary. So it really is about how do we now shift that gap. And that's not only to stem the suffering, but it's also to open up that huge potential. I mean, we all know the difference in ourselves between us on our kind of A game on a good day and those days when we're really suffering. So it's about how do we reduce that gap?
Well said. And what are some of the trends in mental health that you believe need more attention?
I think it is a little bit what I was saying, but I think I'm particularly there are many areas that we can focus on. For me, a personal passion is particularly understanding the mental health for those younger generations coming through. I think, we will all have those circumstances that we grow up in, but I think just the levels of new technology and change and disruption, off the back of which many positive things can happen. But we do also know that when you feel less control, when you feel exposed, when you feel judged, these are all things that the human brain struggles with. And then we have a new generation coming through where, sort of everything's captured through smartphones. You must, I think that the technology has evolved ahead of our social protocols in terms of how we deal with that. And so understanding, I think, that level of pressure, particularly for young generations, who are still building their own well-being, their anchors, their communities, the things that keep them strong, they are growing. And I think back on my own youth, the kind of things I would say, and I'm so glad that I can now move on and learn without it being sort of, captured. So I personally have a real empathy for the mental health of younger generations. And certainly we've seen from a statistics point of view, the kind of levels of attempts for suicide and self-harm. It's something that I think we all need to be very acutely aware of and thinking about.
Very well said. Thank you. My next question is relating to, climate crisis. And when I was reading about it, I also saw, Kokoro, you support the COP2. My question is, what does the intersection between mental health and climate crisis look like?
This is a fascinating one because, of course, the relationship is bidirectional, and there's a lot more research now being done, including by Imperial College London, who you mentioned earlier, Wellcome Trust, and actually institutions all around the world that are starting to really put the data towards what we intuitively know. But if you think about the impact of the climate crisis on many different ways, firstly, again, coming to a younger generation, it isn't, it's an existential threat. Plus that sense that there isn't the urgency of policy making and action going into something that is so dangerous and so significant. So it's a combination of not only the problem itself, but also that sense of frustration and anger that it's not being dealt with.
Right.
But also there's the very practical issues around the impact of extreme weather events, the impact of heat, the impact of being forced to migrate and leave, particularly for communities for whom that land is part of their culture, identity. So, issues of grief and trauma, anxiety, depression, all of these things. But of course, when I say bidirectional, the impact of mental health on our capacity to cope at an individual level and a collective level is also really important, because I talk about this is the crisis of our time, and we need to be able to do big change, which again, we know is not easy. We know our brains are not geared to, for some people, they love it, but for lots of us, it's difficult. Right. big change, big uncertainty, the need for huge collaboration and massive creativity. These are all things that, that strong mental health is geared towards. Whereas if we are suffering, it's kind of like that vicious cycle. It makes it harder for us to do the things that we need to do. So we are COP Squared, which you mentioned, is playing on Conference of Parties and COP, the big kind of global climate negotiations. But COP Squared stands for Care of People and Planet.
Okay.
The idea is to integrate mental health support and psychological resilience into the UN Race to Resilience, which is global adaptation all around the world. So it's saying, look, even if we were to stop carbon emissions today, we know that the following changes are coming down the line.
Okay.
We need to adapt our physical infrastructure, but the work that we're doing is also saying for those communities that are on the front line, they also need the support to be resilient as communities, not just in terms of physical, but also their kind of social and mental structures. And you know, that's so important as well. Just because it's something that's perhaps harder to envisage doesn't mean it's something that we shouldn't be supporting.
Well said. And Jules, what was your experience of the impact of the pandemic that we have just all been through on mental health challenges with a lot of people?
I think it was just one of those key moments. Like, you know, mental health issues have always, you know, we all live with mental health in the same way we all live with physical health, and we're always on a spectrum, all of us. But I think COVID was one of those moments where just the level of understanding and awareness really came through. I think particularly for companies, workplace well-being went from being a nice to have to being a complete must-have expectation. And again, it's sensible. If you're thinking about productivity and creativity, then you must think about mental health. But I think it went from being something that has just now become so mainstream. And what we're now starting to see, and I think this is really exciting, is starting to see companies think beyond workplace well-being. So it's a little bit like if you think on the environmental track, years ago, companies would think about the carbon footprint of their building. And then they started to think about their supply chains. And then they started to think about how do we contribute to the crisis in a positive way, thought leadership, et cetera, innovation. And I think we're starting to see off the back of COVID, big companies like, right, we need to sort out workplace well-being. Then we need to start thinking a bit bigger about this. We know that this is an issue of our time, and how are we contributing in a positive way? And I think COVID was the kind of trigger for that.
Fascinating. I've also spoken to many people who are working on mental health issues, and a lot of them are now using technology to be able to monitor a lot of the progress and support a lot of people suffering from different types of mental health. How are you using technology at Kokoro?
So for us, we focus on the funder community. So it's not massive. We use tools. So for example, we have a database where funders can share the organizations, the entrepreneurs, the charities that they're supporting. And it's kind of a trusted community where people can see who's doing what and learn from each other. We have, tools to allow them to kind of network better together. But we're as a community level, we perhaps use it. We have less to gain. But from looking at new technologies and mental health, I think I look at the health sector over the next 5-10 years as one that is going to massively benefit from this point of support needs to be very personal and tailored at scale. And that's something that to date we've always struggled with. How do you have very personalized medicine support, service, care, but do it in a way that people, 8 billion people can access it globally?
Right.
And I think we, both physical and mental health, the reason we're starting to see a lot of money going into it, which is great, is because the potential for what new technologies can do to provide individual care at scale is completely transformational. Right. So I think watch this space would be my proper answer.
Absolutely. Well said. My next question is, mental health is something which is now beginning to get accepted in society, in communities, within families. How can individuals be more responsible in supporting and promoting mental well-being?
I think it's such an important and good question. I now work in mental health, and yet I catch myself all the time not doing the best that I can for those around me, let alone myself. And I think it is a bit of a rewiring in the sense that for years, the way I was brought up, I thought of physical health as something that was an important part of my life, and I would try to eat well, and I'd try to exercise, and I'd try to, avoid doing things that I knew were harmful. And I'm now, even though I work in it day to day, I still struggle to integrate and mainstream protection of mental health, both for me and others around me, in a way that I know would be beneficial to myself and others. So it's kind of very frustrating because it's so obvious, but I think it is, there's a responsibility to learn, and there are some brilliant things out there. One just to shout out is set up by Born This Way, which is Lady Gaga's foundation. And it's a certificate called Be There Certificate, which is just simply about how to be there, both for yourself and for others, in a responsible way. It's 2 hours of free training. Anyone can do it. And so I think there are various things like that where you can learn. But I think it's also then trying to almost integrate. They always say that habits are best picked up when they're attached to established habits.
Correct.
So like every morning we get up and brush our teeth. And we do that, and we always have done that. It's almost like you need to be able to attach a new habit that is specifically focused on your mental health to existing habits in your day, and just try and mainstream it.
What a great response. Thank you. My next question is that, when you work with so many different institutions to be able to support funding so many others, how do you ensure that your initiatives are culturally sensitive and globally inclusive?
Again, it's a really great question, and a difficult one, because just as I was saying, our mental health is very personal to ourselves. Culturally, it is a very different conversation in different parts of the world.
Right.
It's really important to remember that in some communities, mental health is still one of those issues, or mental illness, where it's also linked to great abuses of human rights. There are still communities where shackling happens, where people are literally tied to a bed or a tree, etc. To die by suicide is still a crime in some countries. And so I think in some ways I get very excited that I feel like, particularly for younger generations, stigma is a sort of thing of the past, and the conversations are much more evolved and mature. And yet at the same time, undoubtedly there's still stigma. I was actually called up. I went to do a talk at my old employer, and I'd said about how I spoke so openly about some of my poor mental health. And one of the people listening really challenged me, and she said, well, you can do that because you've got to a position of leadership. Would you have done that lower down the chain when you were thinking that the people who were hearing it might affect your next promotion? And when she was right. She was absolutely right. It's not, so even when I talk about, it's great, there's far less stigma, she was absolutely right. I don't think I would have done. And that means that there's still such a long way to go. True. To really get this sense that, this is health. Taking it seriously is about getting the best out of yourself as well as others, and that it's a positive thing, not something to be being away from.
Absolutely. In fact, I've often said, mental health issues need a lot of courage to come out of the closet, so to speak, because people are not willing to talk about it.
And even then, I think sometimes there's that sense of, well, it's okay for them because they've had a really serious issue. So for me, I'd worked with survivors of sexual violence, for example, and I always felt, well, they've had something really awful happen to them. Or, when you think about PTSD and soldiers, it's like, they've had something awful, totally understandable that they're dealing with trauma. I suffered and was diagnosed with something called secondary trauma, which is I'd listened and I'd empathized, and in my very, my head works in big images. I felt like I had, my brain felt like it had seen some of that trauma. But it took a long time for me to accept. I was just like, oh, poor little privileged girl has trauma. Like, I really struggled with it because I was I didn't feel like I deserved it. It was like, I was very unkind to myself. And so it's always recognizing that this is not competitive. Everybody's situation is their own situation, and we all have to care for the for the issues that we feel without any judgment, even to ourselves, let alone this kind of comparative situation, which
very well said.
Not very healthy for anyone.
No, absolutely. My next question is that, again, when I was reading about you, there is something that I think you created, which is the Future Mental Health Collective. What inspired this creation, and what do you do in this initiative?
So this was founded by the founder of Kokoro, a lady called Natasha Muller, who's an incredible advocate, activist, and supporter of mental health around the world. And she, during COVID, actually, she really felt that the need was, that it was just going really, really, really in a bad direction. So she got together with just a few other friends at the time who she supported and were funding different mental health initiatives. And as much as anything, they were there for each other, just, trying to figure out how to do the best thing in this situation. That has gone from being a group of friends a few years ago to now being a global network of 140 major mental health funders, individuals, families, and companies who are all supporting the implementation and support of kind of access to services, advocacy, communication around mental health. And it is an incredible community that is there to collaborate, radically collaborate, and amplify what each other's doing. But they're also there as a community for those that want to get started, but perhaps are a bit intimidated and don't quite know where to go with it. It's a community of very experienced people who are happy to help others on their journey as well.
Thank you. So I have time for two more questions for you. My next question is that, given all the work that you are doing in the area of mental health, how do you see the landscape of mental health changing in the next few years?
I think it is going to go through quite a radical change. And I think it comes back to what you were asking about before in terms of technologies. One of the ways in which I think it is changing is metrics. And again, this reminds me of some previous journeys, where we go through the creation, then the adoption of sort of standard metrics that then allow for financial products and people to be and consumers to be able to compare like for like. And I remember when it kind of went through that journey on diversity, then on sort of environmental issues, and I think mental health is on the same track. And what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of innovation, using new technologies to really start collecting data in a way that you can categorically show trends that we intuitively suspect or know, or anecdotally get the kind of reporting, but to then really be able to analyze and then learn from data. So I think whether it be through wearables or through phone data or through all sorts of different ways, we will get to a point where just the field is able to evolve. Capital is able to be deployed in bigger amounts because the risk is lower, because there is that kind of factual and the science is in line with that. So I think the two, plus the growing interest, plus the growing conversation, all of those things together, evolving, create just an extraordinary new a sector that is very old, but in a very different guise, I think, than where it has been.
Very interesting. And Jules, my last question to you, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. What is the one message you want to leave with our viewers and listeners regarding mental health?
So I got coached by a neuroscientist, and she told me, Dr. Tara Swart, she told me, when I was kind of trying to grow as a leader, she told me about neuroplasticity, which wasn't particularly a concept that I had learned much about. But this sense that we can evolve our wiring. There are things that we can do throughout our lives to really support our own mental health, and also being very conscious of how we impact others. I found that very empowering, because I think sometimes it can be, you know, you can feel that this is who you are, and without necessarily feeling that agency. But knowing that actually, if you take the time to really understand your mental health, what triggers you in a positive way, what kind of builds up in a negative way, and if you use the tools that are out there, that you really can create incredible change for yourself, I think is something that I would just say. So don't ever think of it as something that isn't worth the effort. It really is, in the same way that, as I say, physical health doesn't come instantly, but it's worth the effort. And I would say mental health is absolutely life-changing, but it's worth the effort for yourself and for others.
Well said. And on that note, Jules, thank you so much for talking to me about your amazing journey from a diplomat to a mental health champion. Thank you for talking to me about Kokoro and so many different aspects of mental health. Thank you also for talking to me about the last message that you gave, which is how important it is to understand your mental health. Because once you understand it, this is something which is not insurmountable. And as someone else said to me, you know, you're willing to talk about your heart, you're willing to talk about your legs, about your hands. The brain is another organ. Why are you not talking about it? So I think a lot of people will listen to your words of wisdom, and I'm sure this conversation hopefully will do a lot of good to a lot of people.
Thank you. And actually, because I know quite a few of your listeners are in India, can I just mention one incredible champion?
Absolutely.
So there's a lady called Raj Marawala, who runs the Marawala Health Initiative, doing incredible work. She's not the only one, but I just wanted to flag her as someone to look at.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe I'll ask you to introduce me to Raj, and I'll have a conversation.
Great idea. Great idea.
Thank you, Jules.
Thank you again for having me.
Bye-bye. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.